great class. Okay, it should be publishing on YouTube right now. And while we're waiting for everything to get set, and I appreciate, thank you everybody, without the little countdown that always asks you to tell me where you're tuning in from. People are writing it in, so thank you, and please tell me if you're watching on Facebook, where are you tuning in from? If you're watching on YouTube, where are you tuning in from? We appreciate that very much. That adds comments to the feed, and that draws more people to it. Okay, so I think our workaround is working. Let me know if the sound is good in Facebookville. Is the sound good? I've got see if you want to see, I've got two microphones here. I've got the extra microphone for Facebook, and the regular one is going to YouTube. So hopefully everything is working and the sound is clear and pristine. Let me know. All right, let me get the YouTube comments up. That should be working. I mean, there's definitely some kind of a life lesson here. You know, we do the same exact setup every day since, you know, probably, I think we were in this format in terms of the electronics probably in May of 2020. Right? It took a little while to get everything settled, but for, you know, over a year, we've been doing the same exact way every day, and suddenly the same thing you've been doing every day doesn't work. Yeah, that is life. That is life. Things like that happen. Okay, but just let me know if everything is good. Probably you are commenting, and right now Facebook isn't showing me new comments. It's so funny. It's like Facebook wants us to move on from Facebook. Okay, so go to YouTube. You can watch on YouTube, watch on YouTube. Bree says, great sound, Baruch Hashem. Thank you so much, Bree. Melissa was here. I had a little birthday party today that Nina threw for me. My birthday's actually this coming Wednesday on the Gregorian calendar. But we took advantage of having a party on a Sunday. Saw so many friends that we hadn't seen since before COVID. Everybody was vaccinated, so we could hang out and hug and have a great time. It was really very nice. I'm very grateful to Nina for arranging that. Okay. Just doesn't want... It's funny. I don't know. All right. I think everything is working. I'm just not able to monitor the feed on Facebook. Just give me 1 second. Thank you for being patient. Not having the feedback that I normally have just to know that things are working. It makes me feel good when I know. Yes. Okay. Everybody is here. Great. Deborah's in the Kern Mountains. Ian in Miami. I saw a few names before. I'm not seeing those comments right now. But Lucy says the sound is good on Facebook. And Yehuda, thanks for your perseverance. And Bella's in Venice. And Krista says you sound great. And Madi Hennikin, shalom from Finland, waking up to a new week. It's so good to be with all of you, my friends. And thank you for your perseverance that our class is back together, as it were. And over there on the YouTube side, Janice Ridgway says, we're good here on YouTube. No buffering, hearing you clearly. Yeah, I think buffering is the good word for what was going on Facebook. That Today, at least, I tested it before we started the show, so we knew. All right. Today's show's not even going to be very long. It should be quite efficient. So, first of all, I want to dedicate today's learning to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I don't know if you can see... There's a picture of the Rebbe on my wall back here. It's on the YouTube camera. I believe the Facebook camera might be a little low, but you've seen it before. We're very grateful to the Rebbe, who would have imagined that, you think of the Hasidic dynasties, Hasidic groups. If you're not sort of familiar with the Hasidic world, there's many Hasidic dynasties. And, to some extent or to a great extent, Hasidic movements are, about protecting the beauty of their tradition and kind of keeping it in the fold, and very often a little bit removing themselves from the world. So who would have imagined that one of the Hasidic movements, thanks to the vision of its Rebbe, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, would say, no, we're not going to keep to ourselves. As a matter of fact, our mission is to make sure that every Jew out there in the world has the opportunity to connect with the tradition. There's so many Jews, like the Jews that Nina and I were, who were sadly disconnected and had just never experienced the beauty, the marvel, the warmth, the Torah, the truth, etc., the inspiration of really authentic Judaism. So many people, Jews have turned their backs on Judaism who never experienced Judaism, right? And so Chabad made it its mission to get out there and at least make it possible for people to connect with Judaism wherever they live. And the Rebbe sent out an army of emissaries around the world. And now it just seems so familiar. Oh, yeah, there's Chabad house here, Chabad house there, Chabad rabbi here, Chabad rabbi there. Recent Pew report said that 38% of all Jews have had connection of some sort with Chabad. And the younger they are, the higher that percentage is. Really incredible statistic. And it was just the vision of the Rebbe. So I thought I would just read very short little account. These days you can hear a lot of stories about the Rebbe and teachings of the Rebbe. This is a very short, very personal little moment to give you an insight into what kind of a man he was. Because really the great sages, you can learn as much from their teachings as from their actions, right? So listen to this. This is from our dear friend Mendel Kalmanson. He's the Chabad rabbi in the Belgravia neighborhood in London. And he wrote this book of very concise little nuggets of stories about the Rebbe. So this one is called True Caring. The Rebbe's wife, the Rebbitzin, so the wife of the Rebbe, the Rebbitzin, her name was Chaya Mushka, and she was suffering from an eye ailment. This is all a true story. And the Chassid, one of the disciples, who arranged for her to see a specialist, asked her, well, did you ask the Rebbe for a blessing? And she said, I didn't. And he said, respectfully, but Rebbitzin, people write to your husband from all around the world asking for his blessing, particularly when they're ill or they have a condition and they're asking for a blessing for healing. He's your husband. Why wouldn't you ask him for the same kind of blessing? I didn't want him to worry, she replied simply. In fact, let me read it correctly. I don't want him to worry, she replied simply. The Chassid decided to bring the matter to the Rebbe himself. The Rebbitzin has a problem with one of her eyes, he said, and I've arranged for her to see a specialist. She doesn't want to mention it because she doesn't want the Rebbe to be concerned. So I want to ask you for a blessing on her behalf. The Rebbe said, thank you for letting me know about her condition. I will offer a special prayer for her. But please don't mention to her that you told me. I don't want her to be upset. Is that not so beautiful? That's a marriage, They're both so concerned about the well-being of the other. Physical well-being, the emotional well-being, the spiritual well-being, and they just don't want to impose on the other. I mean, imagine when the Rebbe was alive, hundreds of people would come to him every day to ask for a bracha because the prayers of a tzaddik, of a great righteous Rebbe like him, are thought are seen, are proven to be very powerful. And she didn't want him to be concerned. She didn't want to impose on him, but really she didn't want him to worry about her. They transmitted this to him. Of course he prayed for her and gave her a blessing, but he didn't want that she should know that he knew because then she would be upset that she had caused him worry. What a beautiful couple. I wish I had met them personally. I lived in New York at the time that the Rebbe was there in Crown Heights, and it just never occurred to me to go and meet him, and I wish I had. Okay. Let me just reload this again. It does seem to be flowing. Okay. All right. Where are we holding? This is today's page is Samech Gimel. I think I mentioned today's Gimel Tammuz. I mean, the reason we want to dedicate today's page, today's learning to the Rebbe is that this is his yahrzeit. Today is the anniversary of his passing from this world. And that's why we're dedicating our learning to him and why I told you that story. So may our learning accrue to his merit and give his neshama, which is already has such a great, great elevation, maybe even just a little hair's breadth higher. And we say amen. Okay, so we're on page 63 here in Tractate Yoma. These are the laws of Yom Kippur. We're in chapter 6 here in the 6th volume of the Talmud. And we are still learning the commentary, the Gemara, on the first Mishna of chapter 6. And we have commenced our discussion of the scapegoat of Yom Kippur. When the temple was standing, one of the offerings of the day was a pair of goats. One was slaughtered in the sanctuary, in the temple complex, outside in the courtyard, and its blood sprinkled inside the Holy of Holies, as we've learned. And its partner goat was sent out to the wilderness, out to a place called Azazel, and it was understood to be carrying the sins of the Jewish people out into the wilderness with it. And that is where the term scapegoat in the English language comes from. We pick up our discussion at the bottom of page 62 on the B side. The Gemara asks, what is different about the goat whose sacrificial rites are performed inside the sanctuary? In other words, the goat selected to be sacrificed as a sin offering, for which the goats are not valid because they lack the lottery. Now, the discussion that we're picking up sort of in the middle of is not that we're distinguishing between the goats. We understand the high priest is going to draw lots, one slaughtered inside, one goes out to the wilderness. But in trying to understand the specific sacrificial status of these goats, the Gemara is drawing comparisons to other kinds of offerings and asking what sorts of errors in bringing them would render the offering not valid. And so a comparison has been made toward the end of yesterday's page, and basically asking, and this is what we're discussing today, is, well, if you slaughter them out of order, that was something we're looking at the end of chapter 5. In other words, you did something that was of the Yom Kippur rites that comes later, and you did it before, that would render whatever you did next out of order, as if you'd done nothing. You'd have to do that over again. Or what if you slaughtered these goats outside, not only before their time, like before the lots were drawn upon them, for example, but what if you set goats aside to be the Yom Kippur goats, but then you slaughtered them not even in the temple, before the lots were drawn, and not even in the temple? Now, are you liable for violating the law against bringing an offering outside the temple? Once the temple was built, it was illegal against the Torah law to bring an animal sacrifice anywhere but the temple. You could only bring offerings to God in the place that God had said, this is the place where offerings are going to be brought. And the temple was anointed in that way. It was chosen with God's blessing by David. That's the spot. Solomon built the temple. God let Solomon know that he approved that was the temple, and the offerings would only be brought there. Same law as when the tabernacle stood in the wilderness. Once the tabernacle was built, it became illegal to bring offerings anywhere else. So now we're talking about, okay, well, if you, for example, have an animal offering, for certain kinds of offerings, it has to be a minimum of 8 days old. You can't bring a lamb that's younger than 8 days old as an offering where a lamb would be a valid sacrifice. If you brought it before it was 8 days old, that's not a valid offering. So even if you slaughtered it outside the temple, it was never a valid offering, so you would actually not be guilty of bringing an offering outside the temple, since it was never really an offering in the first place. So now they're saying, well, what about these Yom Kippur goats? Maybe you set them aside to be the Yom Kippur goats, but if you did it when it wasn't Yom Kippur and you slaughtered them outside the temple, or you slaughtered them before the lots were placed upon them, and you did that outside the temple, are you guilty of bringing an offering outside the temple? Or are these just goats and you shouldn't have done it, but you're not guilty of that law? That's the discussion that we're in the midst of. So, Okay, so if we're talking about the goat there's two goats. One was chosen to go out into the wilderness. That's a different case. With regard to the goat that was chosen by lottery on Yom Kippur to be brought as a sin offering within the temple, okay, so that goat is going to be a sin offering, at least after the lot has been cast on it. So what happens if you slaughter that goat outside the temple? It would seem like you'd be guilty of bringing an offering outside the temple. The entire Yom Kippur service must be performed in the proper sequence, and several steps have to be executed before the additional offerings are sacrificed, including the sprinkling of the bulls and the goat's blood and the burning of the handful of incense. Since the additional offerings cannot yet be sacrificed, the goats cannot be considered fit for these offerings, and one should not be liable to receive kares for slaughtering those goats outside the temple courtyard. So you might think, well, they're the Yom Kippur goats, they're not ready to be slaughtered, maybe because they haven't had the lots cast on them. So if I slaughter that outside the temple, I'm definitely going to be exempt from this transgression. But somebody else could argue, yeah, but they could have been fit to be brought as the additional offerings of Yom Kippur. And since they were fit to be brought as that kind of offering, and you slaughtered them outside the temple, so you would be liable. You would be guilty of that transgression. These are the two sides of the argument. And the Gemara answers, Rav Chisda holds that an offering is not considered to be lacking time, meaning like for example, a lamb that has not reached its 8th day, it is lacking its time. But Rav Chisda says an offering is not considered to be lacking its time, or thus premature and therefore not valid as an offering. He says it's not that situation if it's going to be brought on that day. So even though some preliminaries haven't been done yet on that day, the fact is, if it could be slaughtered on that day, we're not going to call it lacking time. That's according to Rav Chisda. However, if it is the proper, it is therefore unfit if it is supposed to be brought, but if it's supposed to be brought on a different day and you slaughter it on that day, it is lacking time. But if it is the proper day, but the right moment in that day has not yet arrived, according to Rav Chisda, the offering is considered valid. On the other hand, before the high priest draws lots to determine which of the two goats will be sacrificed to God and which will be sent to Azazel, even though it is the proper day, the goats are not yet considered valid offerings because there is a necessary action that the high priest must take with regard to the goat itself before it can be brought as an offering. It's not just that other things have to happen that day before it's the time to slaughter the goats, but with respect to the Yom Kippur goats, the lottery has to be done. The two lots have to be drawn on those goats. And since that hasn't been done yet, even though it is the day that they're going to be slaughtered, before the lots have been cast, it is lacking its time and it is not a valid offering yet. And so if you slaughtered it outside the temple, you'd be exempt from liability for bringing an offering outside the temple. Ravina said, now that Rav Chisda said that although the drawing of lots is external to the animals themselves, an animal lacking the lottery is comparable to an animal lacking an action, and it is not yet considered a valid offering. Now that we understand that, a statement can be made with regard to that which Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, namely, peace offerings that one slaughtered in the temple before the doors of the sanctuary were opened are disqualified. Now, we've learned about peace offerings called shlamim, right? When we were learning about Passover in Tractate Pesachim, and we learned that there would be groups of people who would arrange to share together. When the temple was standing, they would go to Jerusalem and they would eat the Paschal lamb together. They would bring the Pesach, right? So that's where the name in Hebrew of Passover, the Pesach, it's that offering. It's a lamb or a goat. You have to arrange in advance that you're going to share it together. It gets slaughtered in the temple complex. Some of its blood gets dashed on the altar. Then they bring it out of the temple to a place where they have their campsite in Jerusalem. And those people will eat that lamb that night while they tell over the story of God redeeming the Jews from Egypt. Now, if it's a large group and a small lamb, there's not going to be enough meat in that lamb for people to really celebrate and have a festive time. As the sages said, where there's no meat, there's no joy, right? Without basar, there's no simcha, right? So part of a celebration is like you have a nice barbecue. So they would bring additional offerings, not just additional meat, but peace offerings that are brought in the temple but are eaten by its owners. Very similar procedure to the Paschal lamb. So with regard to these peace offerings, what we're learning now is, okay, when the peace offerings are slaughtered in the temple courtyard and then the meat is taken out of the temple and brought to the campsite where people are going to enjoy it on the festival, when they're actually slaughtering the shlamim, the peace offerings in the courtyard, one of the requirements of that procedure of bringing a peace offering is that the doors of the sanctuary are thrown open. Right? That you could actually look into the sanctuary and all the way through it and see the incense altar and the menorah and the showbread table and the partition at the back that separates between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. People can see into it, right? And I think also the doors of the temple courtyard itself have to be thrown open. It's like the temple is open for all. And those open doors are part of the procedure for bringing a valid peace offerings. So now Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, if those doors are not open, then the peace offerings, those animals that were slaughtered to be peace offerings, are not valid as peace offerings. They are disqualified. How do we know? As it is stated with regard to peace offerings, Leviticus 3:2, and he shall slaughter it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now that's a reference to the tabernacle in the wilderness, but the temple replaced the tabernacle. So just as the entrance to the tent of meeting would imply that it was open into the sanctuary, so too the doors of Solomon's temple or of the second temple needed to be open at the time that the peace offerings were slaughtered. Which teaches that it must be slaughtered when the entrance is open and it serves as an actual entrance, but not when it is locked. As long as the entrance to the tent of meeting or in the temple, the doors of the sanctuary, remain closed, one may not sacrifice the peace offerings, and if they are sacrificed, they are disqualified. Based on Rav Chisda's statement, he slaughtered them outside the temple because the doors of the sanctuary were opened. He is exempt. Based on Rav Chisda's statement, if he slaughtered them outside the temple before the doors of the sanctuary were opened, he is exempt. So now we're looking at this case of, okay, is a person who slaughtered this animal offering, this peace offering, outside the temple, is he liable for transgressing the Torah prohibition on slaughtering offerings outside the temple? So if it was going to be a peace offering, if he did it before the doors were open, let's say in the morning before the doors were open, so then that animal was not yet fit to be a peace offering. So what he did outside of the temple was nothing. He slaughtered an animal, but he didn't bring an offering outside the temple. If he did it after the doors were open, right, then it was fit to be a peace offering that could only be slaughtered in the temple complex. He slaughtered it outside the temple. Therefore, he has violated that law and he is liable for his actions. What is the reason? Lacking the opening of the doors is comparable to lacking an action. Therefore, the offering was not yet fit to be sacrificed in the temple, and when he slaughtered it outside, despite doing so with the intention that it is a sacrificial offering, he meant to bring a sacrificial offering, which would make him liable, but since it was unfit because the doors were not yet open, he got away with it. He's exempt. Rav Chisda stated above that since the Yom Kippur goats could be used for the additional offerings of the Yom Kippur day, not peace offerings because we're fasting on Yom Kippur, but there are additional offerings of Yom Kippur, one is liable for slaughtering them outside the temple. Now the Gemara asks, wait a minute, does Rav Chisda accept the principle choil, since? This word since, meaning well, you didn't do the thing that you'd be liable for, or you did do something that you'd be liable for, but since you might have intended it in a different way, we're actually going to keep you exempt. You're going to get away with it because maybe you didn't have maybe you had the wrong intention, but you could have had the right intention. This principle of since, it sort of adds flexibility to these laws. We've encountered this principle before. Not all sages hold by this idea that, well, since you could have done it in a different way, you didn't. But since you could have, we're actually going to give you a lenient ruling based on the idea that you could have brought it in the permitted way, even though you brought it in the prohibited way. It's a way for them to be a little more flexible. And didn't Rav Hista, so the question is, does Rav Hista hold by this principle of since? Or maybe he's one of the more strict sages that says, no, we don't buy that. What was your intention? It was or it wasn't, period. Now, didn't Rav Hista say, if one slaughtered a Paschal lamb outside the temple, where am I? If one slaughtered a Paschal lamb outside the temple during the rest of the days of the year, other than on Erev Pesach, the afternoon before Passover, when we're supposed to slaughter the Paschal lamb. So he's meaning to bring a Paschal lamb. The Paschal lamb can only be slaughtered one afternoon a year. It's the only time that it is correct to slaughter the Paschal lamb, and that is on the afternoon before Passover begins that night. So if you slaughter at any other time of the year, it's a funny principle. If you intend to slaughter a Paschal lamb, okay, if you are having the thought, I want to slaughter this as my Passover lamb, but somehow you got the date wrong, and so you slaughtered it not on the afternoon before Passover. Okay, so if you did that outside the temple, you made a mistake, like you thought it was okay for you to slaughter it outside the temple, or you did it for some reason you thought that. If you intended to slaughter it as a Paschal lamb, well, you did nothing, because Paschal lambs can't be slaughtered on any other day, so this was not in its time. It's disqualified. So what you did is nothing. You haven't violated any law. But if, hold on a second. If you slaughtered it on the afternoon before Passover begins that night, intending it to be a Passover lamb, and you did it outside the temple, okay, well, that was a qualified offering slaughtered in the wrong place, so you would be liable for transgressing that law. Again, if one slaughtered a Paschal lamb outside the temple during the rest of the days of the year, other than Passover Eve, if he slaughtered it for its own sake, i.e. as a Paschal lamb, he is exempt, since at that time it is not fit to be sacrificed as a Paschal lamb. If, however, he sacrificed it not for its own sake, he might have bought it to be a Passover lamb, but then he said, I'll just slaughter it as a peace offering. Now, you can make a peace offering on any day of the year, but you can only slaughter the peace offerings in the temple when the temple is standing. So if you meant to slaughter it as a peace offering and you did so outside the temple on any day of the year, now you're liable for slaughtering an offering outside the temple. The Gemara comments, the reason he is liable is because he specifically slaughtered it not for its own sake, meaning not as a Paschal lamb, but rather as a peace offering. A Paschal lamb that can't be brought as a Paschal lamb can be brought as a peace offering. It's the same. It has the same requirements in terms of age of animal, type of animal, etc. However, if he slaughtered it without specifying what offering he had in mind, he just slaughtered it. He didn't have an intention that it should be a Paschal lamb or that it should be a peace offering. If he just slaughtered it, it is considered to have been slaughtered for its own sake, and he is exempt. He didn't have an intention, so we're going to be lenient with him and say, well, he thought it was a Paschal lamb. He must have meant it as a Paschal lamb. He slaughtered it not in its time, so he didn't violate any law. And now the Gemara says, but why is he exempt? Let us say, since it is fit to be sacrificed within the temple, not for its own sake, i.e. as a peace offering, it should be considered as though he slaughtered it as a peace offering outside the temple, and he should be liable. Why are we going to make this lenient assumption on his behalf, since he didn't have any intention? And the Gemara responds, how can these cases be compared? there, with regard to the Paschal lamb, it requires explicit uprooting from the status of a Paschal lamb in order to be considered a peace offering. People bring a Paschal lamb. They think it's a Paschal lamb. It can be converted into a peace offering, but if they brought it up to Jerusalem thinking that it's a Paschal lamb, so it's a Paschal lamb. They might not have an intention when they slaughtered it outside the temple that they were thinking, I'm slaughtering this as a Paschal lamb, or I'm not slaughtering this as a Paschal lamb, but they bought it and brought it as a Paschal lamb. So we're going to assume that that intention continues. And therefore, we have a reason to say, since they slaughtered it outside the temple and not on the afternoon before Passover, that therefore they are exempt because they didn't do anything. Rabba Bar Shimi, I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. Rabba Bar Shimi taught these two laws, cited above in the name of Rav Chisda, in the name of Rabba, and he found a difficulty between one statement of Rabba and another statement of Rabba, and he resolved the apparent contradiction as we just resolved it. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yirmiyah said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, if one slaughtered a Paschal lamb outside the temple during the rest of the days of the year, meaning not on the afternoon before Passover, then whether he slaughtered it for its own sake as a Paschal lamb or not for its own sake, meaning as a peace offering, he is exempt. That's different than what we just read. We would have thought that if he slaughtered it as a peace offering, he is liable. Here, Rabbi Yirmiyah said that he learned in Israel, and he brought this teaching to Babylonia, that if he slaughtered a Paschal lamb outside the temple on any other day of the year, he's exempt. Because we're just going to assume it was a Paschal lamb, and we don't care even if he had an intention not to slaughter it as a Paschal lamb. Rav Dimi said, I said this law before Rabbi Yirmiyah and asked him, well, granted, when he slaughters it outside the temple for its own sake as a Paschal lamb, he is exempt because it is not fit to be brought as a Paschal lamb on any other day of the year if that isn't the afternoon before Passover. And one is liable for slaughtering an offering outside the temple only if it was fit to be sacrificed inside the temple. However, if he slaughters it not for its own sake, why is he exempt? Isn't it fit to be sacrificed not for its own sake? Meaning, isn't it fit to be sacrificed as a peace offering in the temple on any other day of the year? And he did that outside the temple? He should be liable. Why are you saying he's exempt? And Rabbi Yirmiyah said to me in response, uprooting an offering's designation outside the temple is not called uprooting. Since he slaughtered it outside, the status of the offering does not change from that of a Paschal lamb to that of a peace offering, despite his intention to this effect. In other words, he had an intention or some kind of mistaken intention to do this wrong kind of offering, but since he was he was so off to think that he could do a Paschal lamb and then convert it to a peace offering and slaughter it outside the temple, he got this thing all wrong. So there's no way that he formulated the specific kind of intention for which he should be punished. This guy's just clueless, so we're not going to hold him liable. Basically, is what Rabbi Yirmiyah was saying to Rav Dimi. That's what I've got for us today. Let us go to your questions and comments. Okay. Sharon Frantbrooks. For my improved understanding, the goat being sent to Azazel, isn't it still a sacrifice to Hashem, just through a different vehicle? I would be disturbed to think that an animal was sacrificed that wasn't an offering to the Holy One. So it is definitely, to God, for God, and we're going to be talking more about this actually in tomorrow. But it's definitely to God and it's commanded by God, but it's not before God in the sense that when we say something is happening before God, it's happening in the temple, right? And that goat is sent out into the wilderness. So even though it's part of this pair, its partner is a sin offering brought in the temple, the one being sent out to Azazel, to that place, it's going to be sacrificed in a different way. it's going to be thrown off this cliff. I mean, it gets killed. It gets killed. It definitely gets sacrificed. And it is being brought for the same kind of purpose as its partner, right? To make an atonement for the Jewish nation on Yom Kippur. Obviously, this is difficult for our modern ear. We're not used to talking about animal offerings. We don't do that. But in the ancient world, this was as common as, apple pie is to us. Forgive me for making such a casual type of analogy. But it was very common, right? But what was different was that, right, this procedure that it's sent out there in the wilderness. And unlike this other sin offering brought in the temple before God and before the nation, the one that's going out to the wilderness, obviously, it's going to God. God is everywhere. It's going to be sacrificed for God, in God's presence, out there in the wilderness, but not with us present. Somehow those sins are going to be removed from our purview when it's sent out into the wilderness. But yes, I would definitely say that you can say that it is sacrificed to God. It's certainly not sacrificed to any other deity, and God forbid anyone should think so. And that's why it became problematic that people came to associate Azazel, which is a kind of, a sin-bearing place in the wilderness. And then later they started to say, oh, well, demons must hang out there. Oh, maybe Azazel is some kind of demonic entity. And that is just completely false, right? There is no God but God. There is no deity but God. God has messengers, angels, and demons that do his bidding for whatever purpose. I mean, demons usually not employed by God, but then we saw that case where the sage was sent to Rome and a demon was sent to do a job for him so that he could save the Jewish people, but sent by God as a messenger. Demons, there's a lot of nuance to what demons are and where they come from and, how we rule over them. They're not powerful, right? There could be a lot of them. They can be scary. They can really scare us. They can even attack people when they are isolated. But if two people are together, the demons are powerless, right? So the demons have no kind of power compared to, what God does in this world. Demons are completely subservient. But that's certainly for another day. Deborah Kamisher, the four doors open of the temple, maybe for peace offerings. Maybe they're like the four directions, east, west, and north, south. Yes and no. I mean, there were gates in the temple complex, at least on three sides. I'm not sure if there was a gate on the west side of the temple complex. There were definitely gates on the east, north, and south. But the door into the sanctuary was only in the east, right? So there was this sense of the whole temple was facing the rising sun. Where we see more of what you're talking about is that we want our blessings, to be received from and to travel to, like all the four directions. We see that a lot more in the rituals of Sukkot, I would say, than on Yom Kippur. But I am drawn to this idea that when the doors are open, everywhere is a place that you can commune with God, right? Because we're inside God. But for some reason, some places do have a higher measure of holiness, right? The Western Wall, where everyone goes to pray now in Israel. Why is that such a holy place? When the temple was standing, that was just like, it's just some spot along a really large exterior fence. That spot, not really different than any other place around this large exterior fence, like exterior, very exterior, around the temple compound, around the temple mount. But once the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was sacked and just about completely destroyed, but this piece of wall remains standing. And Jews have been praying there for 2,000 years. And so many people, unburdening their hearts to God in the same place over centuries and centuries and centuries certainly changes the spiritual character of that place and makes it a holy place, makes it a holier place. Likewise, the Holy of Holies, where we're told that God's presence rests on earth when the tabernacle is among us, when the temple is among us. So if that is that kind of nexus between earth and heaven, the fact that the doors are open, like what difference should it make that wooden doors are open or closed to something as powerful as God's, residence on earth, as it were? But it did matter. and the idea that the channel was more open when the doors were open and that people could see it. There is something to not just feeling, not just knowing, but to seeing. Most of us are such visual creatures in that way. Okay, so finally I have an unrelated question that Nina's passed to me about when Mashiach comes, when the Jewish Messiah comes. And he says, and what happens when Mashiach comes? David in France, I guess David Sider is asking, what happens when Mashiach sets foot in Israel and the ground quakes? Will he be made king, or what happens? So my good friend, Rabbi Reuven Wolf here in Los Angeles, a Hasidic rabbi who is he's like a world-class expert on Mashiach and the Mashiach, everything that's been sort of learned and taught about when the Messiah will come in all of the rabbinic literature and Hasidic literature. And I'll sum it up by saying what Rabbi Wolf said to me. He said, listen, when Mashiach comes, you're not gonna wonder, did he come? You're gonna hear about it on CNN. You're going to hear about it on Fox. You're going to hear about it everywhere, all the time, 24/7. The world will be so fundamentally transformed that it's not going to be the sort of event where some people will say, yeah, the Messiah came, and others will say, no, it didn't come. Everyone will know. There won't be any doubt about it. When Mashiach comes, this world will be so different, there won't be any doubt. And part of what I love about it, and there's he was on my podcast, so if you're really interested in this subject, go to the Accidental Talmudist podcast with Rabbi Reuven Wolf. And one thing that he said, one of the teachings from Psalms is that on that day, the world will be as filled with the knowledge of God as the waters fill the sea. We actually say that in the daily prayers. And what does that mean? Right? That you'll be able to experience God at all times, in all places around the world. And not only that, but you will have access to all of history. History, like for example, the moment when everyone stood at Mount Sinai and received the Ten Commandments, it won't be just a story in a book, right, that you could read, but you could actually just be there. When you want to learn about that, we'll take you there. It'll be like the holodeck in Star Trek. So the sages also said, may Mashiach come soon. I forget which sage it was. This is in the Talmud somewhere. May Mashiach come soon, and may I not live to see it. Why would he say such a thing? Because, Mashiach will come one of two ways. Either because we lift up the earth, and we create peace in the world, and we, elevate the love and peace and harmony in the world, and do righteousness to such a point, or we've suffered enough through history that, the end of time, as it were, the end of history, which is the Messianic age, will be the end of history as we know it. So it will come, with joy and ease. But it might not come that way. It might come in a more apocalyptic way. The wars of Gog and Magog, and with terrible birth pains. The birth pains of the Messianic age could be really terrible. So we don't know. We don't know how it's going to come. Let us hope that the Jewish people have suffered so much, particularly in these last 2,000 years since the temple was destroyed, that in a sense we have been brought as the offering. Right? The Jews have suffered sort of on behalf of humanity, like our suffering has reached such a point that, maybe that'll be enough. And Mashiach will come without terrible travail. We don't know. So may Mashiach come soon, and may his coming be in peace. And we say, Amen. Have a great night.